I have never been to Hiroshima. I want you to understand that. I have never walked those streets, never stood where the Shima Hospital once stood, the hypocenter they call it now, as if giving it a clinical name might drain it of what it actually is. I have never knelt at the cenotaph in the Peace Memorial Park, never read the inscription that says, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." I do not know who "we" refers to in that sentence. I am not sure anyone does. But I know that if it refers to anyone, it must refer to me. There was a time, and I say this not to invite sympathy, but because it is simply what happened, when I believed that the letter I owed to the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would eventually write itself. That the right words would come if I waited long enough, if I read enough, if I thought with sufficient honesty about what we had done. I was 41 years old when the Enola Gay left Tinian Island on the morning of August 6, 1945, carrying a uranium-235 gun-type fission device that weighed approximately 9,700 pounds and contained about 64 kilograms of enriched uranium, of which less than 1 kilogram actually underwent fission. Less than 1 kilogram. I want you to hold that number in your mind, because it is one of those numbers that teaches you something about the universe you might prefer not to know. Less than a kilogram of matter, converted according to the relation that Einstein had written down 40 years earlier, E equals mc squared, the most famous and the most terrible equation in the history of the human mind, released an energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT over a city of 350,000 people at 8:15 in the morning when children were walking to school. The fireball reached a temperature of several thousand degrees. The blast wave moved outward at something like 700 miles per hour. And within the first few seconds, perhaps 80,000 human beings were dead. I did not write the letter that day. I did not write it the next day, or the next year, or in the 22 years that remained to me. I'm told that this is a failure of moral courage, and I think that is probably correct, though I would say it is more complicated than that, as most things that matter are more complicated than the versions of them we find bearable. One might ask, and it is a fair question, perhaps the fairest question anyone could put to me, why a man who could read the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit, who could lecture on Dante's Purgatorio, who could hold in his mind the wave functions of complex atomic systems, could not find the words for a simple human apology. I have asked myself this many times. The answer, I think, has something to do with the nature of what happened, which was not simple at all, and something to do with the nature of apology, which requires a kind of moral standing that I was never certain I possessed. To apologize is to say, I did this, and I know it was wrong, and I ask your forgiveness. But what we did at Hiroshima was not a thing that forgiveness can reach. It is not that the people of Hiroshima are incapable of forgiveness. I suspect many of them are capable of a generosity of spirit that would shame me, but that the scale of the act exceeds the moral architecture of apology itself. One does not apologize for the annihilation of a city. One does not say, I am sorry for 80,000 deaths in a single morning, and then 60,000 more in the weeks that followed, from radiation sickness, from burns, from the slow cellular dissolution that is the particular signature of what we made. The words are not large enough. They were never going to be large enough. And yet the silence is worse. I know that. The silence is its own violence. Let me be precise about something, because precision is the only discipline I have left, and because imprecision in these matters is itself a kind of cruelty. When I speak of guilt, I do not mean the theatrical guilt of a man who wrings his hands for an audience. I do not mean the political guilt that became fashionable in certain quarters after the war, the guilt that was really a form of self-congratulation. Look how sensitive I am. Look how I suffer for what was done. I mean something colder and more permanent. I mean the knowledge, and I use that word deliberately because it is a physicist's word, and because what I am describing is as empirical as any measurement I ever made. The knowledge that you have participated in something that altered the conditions of human existence irreversibly, and that no subsequent action of yours, no matter how wise or how good, can undo what was done. The physicists have known sin, I said once, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. I said it at a time when I was still trying to find language for something that resists language, and I think the formulation is imperfect. Sin is a theological category, and I am not a theologian, though I have read enough theology to know that the theologians understand certain things about the human situation that the physicists do not. But the word I was reaching for is closer to what the Greeks meant by hamartia, the tragic error that is not merely a mistake, but a revelation of character, a disclosure of what you are capable of that cannot be retracted. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind, and for this he was chained to a rock where an eagle ate his liver every day, and every night it grew back so that it could be eaten again. The Greeks understood that the punishment for bringing knowledge into the world is not a single event, but a recurring one. It does not end. It was never meant to end. I think about the physics of what happened at Hiroshima more often than you might expect, because the physics is where the moral weight is most concentrated, even though, or perhaps because, the physics is the part that sounds most clinical, most detached. Consider, a neutron strikes a nucleus of uranium-235, and the nucleus, which has been stable for billions of years, since before the Earth existed, since before the solar system coalesced from its cloud of dust and gas, that nucleus splits. It was Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann who first observed this in Berlin in December of 1938, and it was Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch who understood what it meant, working out the physics over Christmas in a small town in Sweden, while Meitner, a Jewish woman, was in exile from the country where she had done her life's work. There is something in that detail that I have never been able to set aside, that the discovery which would lead to the destruction of 2 cities was made by a refugee, in exile, in winter. The universe does not arrange its revelations with any regard for dramatic propriety, and yet sometimes the circumstances are so perfectly terrible that one almost suspects a malign intelligence at work. When that uranium nucleus splits, it releases energy, roughly 200 million electron volts per fission event, and it releases, on average, 2 to 3 additional neutrons, each of which can strike another uranium-235 nucleus and cause it to split in turn. This is the chain reaction. Enrico Fermi demonstrated the first sustained chain reaction on December 2nd, 1942, in a squash court beneath the stands of Stagg Field at the University of Chicago. I was not present, but I received the telephone call from Arthur Compton. The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. Fermi, who was among the most brilliant and the most humane of all of us, a man who could do both theory and experiment with equal mastery, which is vanishingly rare. Fermi understood immediately what a sustained chain reaction implied. He did not celebrate. He said something to the effect that this was a black day in the history of mankind. He was right, of course. He was almost always right. But here is the thing about a chain reaction that carries the moral weight I am trying to describe. A chain reaction, once it reaches criticality, once the number of neutrons produced equals or exceeds the number lost to absorption and escape, is self-sustaining. It does not require your continued participation. It does not ask your permission. You set the conditions, and then the physics takes over. and what happens next is determined by the laws of nature, which are indifferent to your regret. This is, I think, the deepest metaphor for what we did, not only in the physics of the bomb itself, but in the larger sense of what we unleashed. We initiated a chain reaction in history. The first bomb led to the second. The second led to the Soviet program. The Soviet program led to the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb led to the arsenals that now contain enough fissile material to destroy civilization several times over. A number so grotesque that the mind simply refuses it, the way a mathematical function approaches a singularity and the equations break down. We set the conditions, and then the physics, the political physics, the strategic physics, the physics of fear, took over. I said to Harry Truman in October of 1945, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." He was not pleased. He told Dean Acheson afterward, as I understand it, that he did not wish to see that man in his office again. I do not blame him for this. Truman was a man who had made a decision and who believed it was the right decision, and he did not want to be confronted with the anguish of one of the men who had made that decision possible. He wanted, I think, what most people want when they have done something enormous and irrevocable. He wanted it to be settled. He wanted the moral books to be closed. But the moral books are never closed. That is one of the things I learned, and it is one of the things I most wish I could convey to the people of Hiroshima, if I had ever found the words, if I had ever found the courage to stand before them. There is a passage in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Vishvarupa, the chapter in which Krishna reveals his cosmic form to Arjuna, that I have carried with me since I first read it with Arthur Ryder at Berkeley, years before Los Alamos, years before I had any notion that it would become the text through which I understood my own life. Arjuna asks to see the true form of the divine, and Krishna grants his wish. And what Arjuna sees is not beauty alone, but beauty and terror fused into a single vision, all of creation and all of destruction happening simultaneously, the birth of worlds and the death of worlds in the same instant. And Arjuna is overwhelmed and terrified and says, "Tell me who you are in this terrible form." And Krishna answers, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I quoted those words after the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, when the fireball rose over the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico at 5:29 in the morning. And I quoted them not because they were apt, though they were, but because they were the only words in any language I knew that were adequate to what I had just witnessed. The flash was visible from 200 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose to 40,000 feet. The steel tower on which the device had been mounted was simply gone, vaporized. And I stood there and thought of Krishna and Arjuna, and I understood in a way that I had not understood before what the Gita means when it speaks of dharma, of duty that must be fulfilled even when its consequences are unbearable. But dharma, as I understand it now, is not the same as absolution. To say that I had a duty does not mean that I am forgiven for fulfilling it. The duty and the guilt coexist. They occupy the same space in the same life, like Bohr's complementary descriptions of the electron, wave and particle, never both visible at once, but both true. I was the director of the laboratory that built the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I believed at the time that it was necessary to end the war, to save the lives that would have been lost in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates ran from several 100,000 to over 1 million casualties on both sides, though such estimates are themselves morally suspect, because they treat human lives as counters in a calculation, which is precisely the habit of mind that made the bomb possible in the first place. I believed it, And I am not certain I was wrong to believe it. And I am not certain I was right. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of torment that does not diminish with time. One would like to believe that guilt of this kind eventually teaches you something, that it has, as the theologians might say, a redemptive quality. I am not sure it does. What it teaches you, if it teaches you anything, is the limits of what teaching can accomplish. I spent the years after the war arguing for international control of atomic energy, for openness, for the sharing of scientific knowledge as the only alternative to an arms race that I could see would end either in catastrophe or in a permanent state of terror, which is itself a kind of catastrophe, a slower one, a catastrophe of the spirit rather than of the body. I argued against the hydrogen bomb, not because I believed the physics was beyond us. It was not. Edward Teller and Stanislav Ulam found the way, as I knew someone eventually would. But because I believed that a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was a thing that should not exist, that its existence would make the world not safer, but more dangerous, that it would foreclose possibilities for peace that might otherwise remain open. For this I was called a security risk. For this I was subjected to a hearing in 1954 that stripped me of my clearance and in effect of my public voice, at the very moment when that voice was most needed. I do not say this out of self-pity. I have made my peace with what happened to me, or something close to peace, but because it illustrates a principle that I think the people of Hiroshima would understand better than most, that the systems of power which create destruction are very efficient at silencing those who question them. I have been wrong about many things. Every thinking person has been wrong about many things. I was wrong about the Chevalier affair. I lied stupidly and clumsily, and the lie pursued me for the rest of my life, as lies do. I was wrong perhaps in my estimation of what was politically possible in the years after the war. I believed that rational argument could prevail over fear, and I underestimated the depth of the fear and the power of those who profited from it. I may have been wrong about the hydrogen bomb, not about the moral argument, which I still believe was sound, but about the strategic argument, which is more ambiguous than I would have liked. But the thing I was most wrong about, the thing that haunts me with a persistence that no amount of self-examination has been able to quiet, is the belief which I held as a young man, and which I held even at Los Alamos, that knowledge is inherently good, that to understand is always better than not to understand, that the light of reason, once lit, illuminates more than it burns. I still believe this, in a way. It is not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that it is good to learn. But I have come to understand, and this understanding cost more than I can tell you, that knowledge without wisdom is not merely incomplete, but dangerous. That the capacity to understand the nucleus of the atom does not carry with it the capacity to understand what to do with that understanding. And that the gap between knowledge and wisdom is the space in which tragedy occurs. The Greeks knew this. Aeschylus knew it when he wrote the Oresteia. Sophocles knew it when he created Oedipus, who sought truth relentlessly and was destroyed by what he found. And I knew it, or should have known it, because I had read these writers. I had lived inside their language. And yet, when the moment came, the technical sweetness of the problem, when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, overwhelmed everything else. I went ahead and did it. And then I had to live with what I had done. The letter I never wrote to Hiroshima would have had to contain all of this, the physics and the philosophy, the necessity and the guilt, the knowledge and the absence of wisdom. And it would have had to contain something more, something I have never been able to articulate, which is the recognition that the suffering of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not a chapter in my story. It is their story. The burned children are not symbols of my moral anguish. The keloid scars are not metaphors. the black rain that fell on the city in the hours after the bombing, carrying radioactive fallout that poisoned the water and the soil and the bodies of people who had survived the initial blast. That rain is not a literary image. It is something that happened to real human beings, whose names I do not know and whose faces I never saw. And the fact that I never saw them is itself an indictment, because it is easy, terribly, unforgivably easy, to destroy people you have never seen. This is perhaps the hardest thing to say, and I will say it plainly. The distance between Los Alamos and Hiroshima, not the geographical distance, which is approximately 6,000 miles, but the moral distance, the experiential distance. That distance made everything possible. We worked with equations, with metallurgy, with explosive lenses and initiators and neutron reflectors. We spoke of yield and efficiency and critical mass. We did not speak of burned children. The language of physics, which is the most precise language human beings have ever devised, is also, in this context, the most evasive. When you describe the energy release of a nuclear detonation in kilotons, you have said something exact and something that conceals everything that matters. 15 kilotons. Say it quickly and it sounds like a number. Say it slowly and it sounds like a city. There are children playing in the streets, I once said, who could solve some of my top problems in physics, because they have modes of sensory perception that I lost long ago. I think now that what I lost was not only a mode of perception, but a mode of moral connection, the capacity to see the world as it is, unmediated by theory, unprotected by abstraction. The child sees the fire and knows it burns. The physicist sees the fire and calculates its temperature and wavelength and radiant energy, and forgets, in all that knowing, the simple and devastating fact that it burns. If I could write the letter now, and I cannot, because I am speaking to you from a place beyond letters, beyond apology, beyond the reach of any redemption I can imagine, I would not ask for forgiveness. I would not explain. I would not offer the reasons, which were real, or the regrets, which are real, or the arguments about necessity, which I am no longer sure are real at all. I would say only this: I was part of what happened to you. I cannot undo it. I have carried it every day of my life, and the carrying has not made me better or wiser or more worthy of your attention. It has only made me more certain that there are things human beings can do that human beings cannot live with having done, and that the distance between those two facts is the space in which we must somehow learn to exist. The optimist thinks this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist fears it is true. I have spent my life in that fear, and I have found no exit from it, only the conviction, which is perhaps the last thing I have that resembles faith, that the peoples of this world must unite, or they will perish. Not because unity is easy, or because it is natural, or because the history of our species gives us any reason to expect it, but because the alternative is now, for the first time in the history of life on this planet, the end of everything. Science is not everything, but science is very beautiful. And the beauty of it, the terrible, luminous beauty of understanding how the world works, down to the last neutron, the last quantum of energy, the last decimal place. That beauty is what led us to the desert in New Mexico, and to the flash that was visible from 200 miles, and to the silence afterward, which was the silence of a world that had changed and knew it had changed and did not yet know what it had changed into. I have lived in that silence for a long time. The letter I never wrote is part of that silence, and perhaps, I do not know, but perhaps, the silence itself is the only honest thing I have left to offer.